The present purpose is to illustrate how to work with the Samaritan Pentateuch when we're investigating the external evidence to a text critical problem, in this case working with Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. And of course, the Samaritan Pentateuch evidence is listed in the Biblia Hebraica apparatus. However, doing some work with the context itself can also reveal some things to us, and so this illustrates how to go about that. Here's a page from a critical edition of the Samaritan Pentateuch. This is available online, and so it's easy to have access to. So the main text is laid out, and just like the BHQ, it is divided between A lines and B lines as it follows the manuscript. Then there's the next thing we'll take note of is the sources of the critical text are listed sort of as a footnote here. Then following this are three apparatuses below the text. So our main focus here is actually just going to be on using the critical reconstructed text itself. Now in Deuteronomy 32:8, we look at a recent English translation of the Samaritan Pentateuch, and we find that the first three lines, and actually all of it, agrees pretty closely with the Masoretic tradition, here focused on when the Most High divided up the nations. And again, this reflects really a poetical version of the story we find in Genesis chapter 11. And here's the key focus, according to the number of Bnei Israel, that is, according to the number of the sons of Israel. Now, while on the surface it appears that the Samaritan Pentateuch agrees with Masoretic tradition, as we'll see, it's possible that there's separate logics to even this agreement. Also helpful for work on comparing the external evidence of variance is a non-critical version put out by Shoshan. Now, in this case, we have the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch laid out on facing pages, and as can be seen, the differences are highlighted with sort of a larger and bold-faced font in both sides of the comparison. This is a very helpful tool to get quick access to these differences. And we take a look at this comparison. The only difference in Deuteronomy 32:8 between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic tradition is the plane spelling of the word borders. Whereas the question of according to the number of the sons of Israel, that's the same in both traditions. The English translation of the Samaritan Pentateuch, it's also not really a critical edition, but it is very accessible. And there's a marginal note at Deuteronomy 32:8, and there's other kinds of notes throughout the text. In this case, the editor is suggesting that the other nations are 12 in number, and points out that in Genesis 15, the Samaritan Pentateuch, which he calls the Israelite Samaritan version, the Samaritan Pentateuch offers 12 nations like the number of the tribe of Israel. So here he's pointing to a different text variant in Genesis 15, where the Samaritan Pentateuch has a list with 12 in number to corroborate supposedly the tradition in Deuteronomy 32:8 that the other nations are divided up according to the number of the sons of Israel. And as we'll see, this is somewhat different than what's going on perhaps in the Masoretic tradition. Here's a translation of Targum Neofiti, and the pluses in this tradition are marked with italics. And so what we're interested in here is he set up the boundaries for the nations according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. So that is, Neophiti takes that this is 12 nations that the Lord languaged apart according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. So it appears here in this plus of Targum Neophiti agrees with tradition referred to relative to the Samaritan Pentateuch. And the Lord's revealing his will to Abraham in Genesis 15. In the Masoretic tradition, there's actually only a list of 10 nations that inhabit the land that the Lord is granting to Abraham and his descendants. And here's a text note to the BHQ of Genesis chapter 15, verse 21. And referring to the Girgashites, the BHQ editor points out that there's agreement with this list, with the various traditions. However, following Girgashites, the Samaritan Pentateuch has the Hivites. So that's what the abbreviation says here, is that Samaritan Pentateuch adds and the Hivites after the Girgashites. And then there's another note in specific. The Septuagint adds and the Hivites before the Girgashites. And so kind of spelled that out here. Now in both cases, the editor of the BHQ suggests that this is to harmonize the list of nations in the land that God's promising to Abraham with the list that's found in Exodus 3:8. Now it should be noted that the Hivites are in many of the lists in the Pentateuch, not only Exodus 3:8, but several others in Exodus and in Deuteronomy as well. So normally, Hivites are included with the others in the list of the nations that previously inhabited the land God promised Abraham and his descendants. So we can see that the point that the editor is getting at here is that the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch perhaps added and the Hivites in order to cause this list to agree with the other lists in the Pentateuch. To summarize the BHQ note, here's an English translation of the MT, and relative to the Girgashites, the Septuagint adds Hivites before Girgashites, and the Samaritan Pentateuch adds Hivites after the Girgashites. And in both cases, according to the BHQ, this is to help this list to agree with other lists in the Pentateuch. And here I've just laid out from the critical text. Here's in the Samaritan Pentateuch, this is the addition, the Hivites in the list. And here in the critical edition of the Septuagint, there is this plus. So again, in the estimation of the BHQ editor, these are pluses, and perhaps even this harmonistic plus evidence for it being a plus is that the plus is put in different places in these two ancient witnesses. In sum, there's a few observations to make based upon this investigation of external evidence focused on the Samaritan Pentateuch of Deuteronomy 32:8. Now, it's a principle that the shorter text is more likely original. It's not always the case. There can be abbreviations or accidental omissions, but in general, the shorter text, our starting point by default, would be that it's probably more original. And this agrees with the other evidence that in the case of Genesis 15:21, both the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint both seem to have a plus to harmonize the list there with the list elsewhere in the Pentateuch. And this is essentially the judgment given by the BHQ apparatus, is that the MT version of Genesis 15:21 is likely more original. And so we can see what the suggested motives are for making the plus, both in the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch. So it seems that the marginal note in the English translation of the Septuagint is perhaps maybe needs some adjustment. There does seem to be more of a harmonistic sort of situation between the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel in Deuteronomy 32:8. However, even though it's only 11 nations in Genesis 15:21, presumably the Hebrews were the 12th nation. I'm not sure. But this seems to be probably a secondary or unintended harmonistic outcome. That is, the plus in Genesis 15:21 on the surface doesn't seem like it was to try and fix the issue in Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 with the nations numbered according to the sons of Israel, but rather was just to coordinate the list in Genesis 15 with the other lists that included the Hivites throughout the Pentateuch, though further investigation is needed before making this conclusion. And the larger issue, to keep it in focus, is that the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic tradition agree on the last part of Deuteronomy 32:8, that the nations were divided according to the number of the sons of Israel.